This happened 2 years ago, when I had just turned 19. It was my first time living alone. I had found a one-bedroom apartment just outside the city. It wasn't big, but it was clean and affordable. I had just started community college and wanted a place close enough to campus, yet far enough to be peaceful. The building was 3 stories tall with 12 units. I moved into apartment 2A, which was on the middle floor, second door on the right. The place had a small kitchen and a living room with 2 windows facing a quiet side street. The bedroom was in the back, and it came with a built-in closet. The move-in was uneventful. The landlord gave me 1 set of keys and mentioned the unit had been empty for a few months. The last tenant, he said, had left in a hurry. I asked him why. He simply said she'd had some personal issues and needed to be closer to family. He assured me the locks had been changed before I signed the lease. The first few weeks passed without anything strange. I set up my furniture, got into a routine, and always made sure to lock the door before bed. I didn't know many of the neighbors. Most people kept to themselves. There was a retired man at the end of the hall who always nodded politely when we crossed paths. A couple with a small child lived in the unit above mine. The rest of the tenants I only saw in passing, usually in the parking lot or down in the laundry room. I kept myself busy with school and a part-time job at a nearby store. On weekdays, I usually got home late. Most nights, I'd eat something simple and work on assignments from the couch. By the 3rd week, I was fully settled in. Nothing ever gave me a reason to feel unsafe, until one evening. I had just come home from a long class when I noticed something odd. The hallway light outside my unit was off. Now, that light had always stayed on. I noticed it every time, mostly because it helped me line up my keys with the lock. But that night, it was completely dark. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and used it to guide myself to the door. I unlocked it, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I didn't think much of it at the time. Probably just a burnt-out bulb, I figured. I made some dinner, watched something on my laptop, and went to bed around midnight. The next morning, the hallway light was back on. I assumed maintenance had come by and fixed it. Nothing else seemed out of place, until the following Tuesday. I remember the day clearly because I only had one afternoon class. On the way home, I stopped to pick up some groceries. The hallway light was on again. Everything looked normal. I unlocked the door and stepped inside like I always did, then I froze for a second. The kitchen light was already on. I stood there, puzzled. I thought maybe I had forgotten to turn it off that morning, but I almost never forget things like that. I placed the grocery bag on the counter and turned to close the door behind me. When I turned back toward the sink, I froze. There was a woman standing there. She looked like she was in her 40s or 50s. She wore a light sweater and old gray pants. Socks on her feet. Her hair was tied back loosely. She was holding one of my mugs and facing the sink. At first, I just stood there. Completely still. Staring at her. Then, she turned slightly, set the mug down on the counter, and began walking toward the door. She didn't run. Didn't say a word. Didn't ask a question or offer any kind of explanation. She walked right past me. Calmly. Casually. She unlocked my front door and left. I followed her to the doorway and looked out into the hallway. She was already at the far end of the corridor. I didn't see where she went. I didn't hear any doors open or close. Back in the kitchen, I just stared at the mug on the counter. I didn't call the police, because I wasn't even sure what I'd report. There was no damage. No loud noise. No sign of a break-in. But someone had been inside my apartment. She'd walked through it, used my things, and left like it meant nothing. That night, I dragged a chair in front of the door and left the lights on. I barely slept. In the morning, I left early for class. I didn't want to spend another minute alone in that apartment. The whole night kept replaying in my head. Had I left the door unlocked? Or had someone followed me in without me noticing? Before leaving for class the next morning, I checked the lock again. It worked like normal. That afternoon, when I got home, I looked around the apartment carefully. Everything was in place. Nothing seemed disturbed. No sign that anyone had been there. Still uneasy, I messaged the landlord and asked if any maintenance staff or building employees had keys to my unit. He replied a little while later. Said no one had entered the apartment, and asked if something had happened. I didn't go into detail. I just said I thought someone might have gotten in by mistake. He didn't press for more. The rest of the day passed quietly. Nothing strange. But that night, I pushed the dresser in front of the door again. I placed a glass jar on top of the door handle, so I'd hear it fall if the door opened. I didn't hear a thing. The next morning, I caught one of the neighbors, the woman who lived across the hall. She was always polite, but kept mostly to herself. I asked if she'd seen anyone in the hallway the day before. She said she hadn't. I wanted to ask if she knew anything about the previous tenant, but I didn't. The apartment stayed quiet for the next few weeks. Eventually, I started to feel comfortable again. But then, near the end of the month, I came home from class and found a note, folded, slid under my front door. It was blank on one side. On the other, it said, "You forgot to lock the balcony." But I didn't have a balcony. I stared at it for a long time, then threw it away. The next day, I asked the landlord to change the lock again. He agreed. The lock was replaced within 2 days. I also added a chain on the inside, just in case. A few days later, I saw her again. I was walking back from the laundry room when I passed the side stairwell. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up, holding a key in her hand. She didn't see me. I stepped back quietly and waited, until I heard the outside door close. After that, I stayed in the apartment until the end of my lease. Nothing else ever happened. When I finally moved out, the new tenant was standing outside the unit with the landlord. She looked young, maybe around my age. She smiled at me as I passed her on the stairs. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking, holding the last box from that apartment. This happened in 2023, just a few months after my wife and I had our first child. We were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Mississauga, Ontario. I was 29 at the time, working full-time in IT support, and my wife was on maternity leave. Everything was fine, until our daughter turned about 3 months old. That's when we bought a used baby monitor from a local seller online. It wasn't a smart device or anything high-tech. Just a basic model with night vision and a small handheld screen receiver. We set it up above the crib, angled downward. At first, it worked fine. But by the second week, we started noticing strange things. One night, I was alone in the living room watching TV. I glanced over at the monitor screen, and froze. It showed something tall leaning over the crib, as if someone was standing right next to it. I rushed into the room. But no one was there. I told myself it had to be a glitch in the night vision. Nothing more. A few nights later, it happened again. Same time. Same shadow. After the second incident, I didn't tell my wife. I didn't want to scare her. But on the fourth night, the shadow appeared again, standing right next to the crib. This time, I got up immediately and went straight into the room. Again, nothing. When I checked the monitor again, the figure was gone. That night, I told my wife everything. She looked uneasy, but tried to reason it out. Maybe it was a software bug. Or a reflection. Or just poor night vision quality. So we decided to test it. The next day, I borrowed a second camera from my office. We placed both cameras in the baby's room, our original monitor positioned above the crib, and the office camera on a shelf across from it. We synced both to our phones, and waited. At exactly 2:44 a.m., the figure showed up again on the baby monitor. But on the second camera, the room was completely empty. Just our daughter, peacefully sleeping. Even stranger, we watched the crib shift slightly on the baby monitor's feed, like someone had touched it. But on the second camera, nothing moved. That was the first time my wife admitted something wasn't right. The next morning, I checked the baby monitor again. It didn't have Wi-Fi. It wasn't smart. It wasn't connected to anything. There was no explanation for what we'd seen. So we threw it out and bought a new one. And for a few days, everything was quiet. Then one night, at the exact same time, 2:44 a.m., we heard a low crackling noise coming from the hallway. I got up to check. And I saw it, the old monitor. It was sitting near the wall. The screen was glowing faintly. But I had removed the batteries before we threw it out. Somehow, it was on. The screen showed our daughter asleep in her crib. And beside her, was the same figure. Perfectly still. I didn't try to figure it out. I grabbed the monitor, smashed it against the floor, and took the pieces straight to the dumpster. The next morning, I spoke to the building manager. I asked if anything unusual had ever happened in that apartment. He paused for a second, then said, "Before you moved in, a couple with a newborn lived there. Something happened to the baby one night." He said the official report listed it as a sleep-related incident. The father left soon after. And the unit stayed vacant for a while. We moved out within the week. Months later, one of our old neighbors sent a message. A new family had moved into the unit. They also had a baby. And some nights, they said they could hear soft crying through the wall. Even when their own child was sound asleep. This happened last year, when my boyfriend and I returned to Toronto after a 10-day trip to visit his family in Alberta. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a nice building near DuPont Street. I worked part-time at a nearby pizza place, and he managed the inventory section there. Our schedules didn't usually allow for travel, so this was the first time we'd both been away from the apartment for more than just a weekend. We took a late-night flight and finally reached our building around 7:30 a.m. I was completely drained, just wanting to get inside. But when we reached our door, my boyfriend pulled out the keys and tried the lock. It wouldn't turn. He paused, tried again, but it was still stuck. We didn't have a chain lock or latch, just a standard knob and deadbolt, both keyed. No one else had a key, and we hadn't given a spare to anyone. There was no reason the door should be locked from the inside. We called the building manager, who arrived about 20 minutes later with the maintenance guy. She used her master key and managed to push the door open. All three of us stepped into the entry. The lights were off, and the apartment looked exactly the same as we had left it, except for one thing: the heater was on. I was sure we had turned it off before leaving. Once the building manager and maintenance guy left, we went room to room, checking everything. But the more we checked, the more we started to notice small things that didn't feel right. The heater was set higher than we ever kept it, so the air felt much warmer than usual. Then, on the kitchen counter, I saw 2 plates and a mug sitting in the drying rack. They were wet, like they had just been washed. Before we left, we'd cleaned everything and made sure the sink was empty. I opened the fridge, and found 2 plastic water bottles we didn't buy, along with a paper bag from a takeout place we didn't recognize. When I checked the receipt tucked under the container, I saw that the date was from 4 days ago, when we were still in Alberta. In the hallway, the closet door was slightly open. I always close it fully because it tends to drift open if not latched. I checked inside, nothing unusual. We moved on to the bedroom. The bed looked neat, but the blanket was folded differently than we left it. It seemed like someone had used it and then tried to make it look untouched. My boyfriend asked if someone from work or family could have used the place without telling us. I said no one had access. We hadn't given a spare key to anyone. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept thinking about the heater, the small things that didn't belong, but were left behind so neatly. He told me to get some rest and said we'd change the locks in the morning. Maybe ask the manager if someone had entered by mistake, or if anything like this had happened before. But even as I nodded, I knew this wasn't something you could explain away with a simple mistake. Around midnight, I got out of bed and walked through the apartment again. I stopped in the hallway, staring at the front door, remembering how smoothly it had opened earlier that morning, despite being stuck before. I moved toward the living room and stood by the window. Our unit faced the street, and there was no balcony or fire escape on this side. Still, I checked the edges, the frame, and the glass. Everything looked fine. Next, I walked into the bedroom and crouched by the small utility cabinet next to the water heater. We almost never opened it, but something about that day made me curious. Inside, I found an old rolled towel pushed against the corner, and beside it, a flat black screwdriver. The towel wasn't ours. I stood up slowly and checked the bedroom window again, this time, more carefully. At the top edge, the latch was slightly bent, just enough for someone to force it open from the outside and slide it shut again after climbing in. In the morning, we reported everything to the building manager and asked to review the camera footage. It didn't show anything near our door, but one of the back stairwell cameras had caught something 4 days earlier. A man in a hoodie was seen climbing up from the fire escape, holding what looked like a small tool kit. He entered through a back window into the unit beside ours, which had been vacant for months. The police came later that day, checked both units, and found evidence that someone had been using the empty apartment. He'd been slipping between balconies or open windows, quietly living inside other units when tenants were away. They found food receipts, a blanket, even a list of dates scribbled on the wall, dates and unit numbers. Ours was on it. He had probably seen us leave with luggage, watched the place for a day or two, and then let himself in through the bedroom window using the screwdriver. He didn't take anything because he wasn't after valuables. He was looking for shelter, a place to stay warm, to shower, eat, and sleep quietly without being seen. And if we hadn't noticed the heat or checked the fridge, we probably never would have known. I was driving home after hanging out with some friends when I saw a stray dog walking along the side of the road. It was about 10:45 at night, and the street was quiet, except for a few cars passing now and then. The dog looked thin and tired, moving slowly, like it had been out there for a while. Since I was a kid, I've always loved animals. I used to ask my parents all the time if we could help stray dogs or bring them home. They didn't always say yes, but that love for animals never went away. Now that I live on my own and have a dog of my own, I try to be ready for situations like this. I always keep a small bag of dog food and an extra leash in my car just in case I see a dog that might need help. The dog was running down a busy road, weaving between parked cars and passing traffic. I got a little worried it might get hit, but then it turned onto a smaller side street, where there were fewer cars. That's when I decided to try and help. I pulled over and grabbed the bag of dog food I always keep in my car. I walked slowly toward the dog and called out gently, trying not to scare it. For a moment, the dog paused and looked at me. I could tell it was curious, maybe even hungry. I took a few steps back and dropped some food on the sidewalk to make it feel safe. But after a few seconds, it turned around and ran off down the street. I didn't want to give up, so I got back in my car and drove around the block. I turned left at the next street, then left again to get back to the main road. As I came around the corner, I saw the dog again. This time, it looked tired and was moving much slower than before. I stopped the car again and got out, hoping to try one more time. Just then, a big SUV drove by. I looked straight at it because I was afraid the driver might not see the dog and could hit it. While I was watching the SUV, I lost sight of the dog. A moment later, the SUV turned around and came back. It pulled up next to my parked car and stopped. I took a few small steps forward, thinking they would roll down the passenger window to talk. But instead, the driver rolled down the window on his side, which was farther from me. I asked, "Is that your dog?" He said something, but I couldn't understand what he said. Then, the man got out of the SUV, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. He was wearing a ski mask. It wasn't cold out, and there was no reason for him to be dressed like that. He looked right at me and said, "What are you doing? I saw you outside my house." I felt confused, as I had never left the sidewalk, and I had no idea where his house even was. I stayed calm and quickly held up the bag of dog food and the leash I'd brought from my car. I said, "There was a dog. I was just trying to get it to come to me." While I was talking, I slowly backed toward my car. I opened the door with one hand and kept the other on the lock, ready to shut myself inside if I had to. He kept moving toward me. And for a second, I didn't know what he was going to do. Then suddenly, he turned around, rushed back to his SUV, got in fast, and drove off. He didn't even slow down at the stop sign. He just sped around the corner and disappeared. I don't know what that man really wanted or what he thought I was doing, but I'm just thankful to be home now. I'm sitting on the couch with my own dog beside me, trying to calm down. My heart is still beating a little fast, and I keep thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't been careful. I really was just trying to help a stray dog. That's all. I've done this before and never had a problem. But this time was different. Now, I feel like maybe I made a bad decision. Even though my heart was in the right place, a part of me regrets stopping. I keep asking myself, was it worth it? What if he had gotten closer? What if I hadn't been able to get back to my car in time? I hate that doing something kind made me feel unsafe. It makes me think twice about helping again in the future. That's the part that hurts the most. I don't want fear to stop me from being a good person. But after tonight, I can't ignore the risk. I haven't told my fiancé or any of my friends. I already know what they'll say. That I should have just stayed in the car or driven away. That I put myself in danger for no reason. But if everyone starts thinking like that, if we all stop doing small good deeds because of fear, how is anything ever going to change? I don't want to become someone who looks away when help is needed. But right now, I honestly don't know what I'll do next time. I'm 19, and I was driving to school like I do most mornings. I live in a suburban area, and my commute is short, just about 15 minutes. So, I was driving alone in my car, heading to campus for my first class. I had just turned right onto one of the main roads near the school, and there was a tan BMW in front of me. We both made the same right turn. I switched to the next lane and drove past him since I was moving faster. I didn't cut him off or drive aggressively, but still, I think he beeped at me. I wasn't sure why, and I remember checking my mirrors to see if I had done something wrong. But nothing looked off. There was a stoplight ahead, but the one I needed was further down. I kept going and didn't think much of it at the time. As I approached the next intersection, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the same BMW was still behind me. But now, his right turn signal was on. I figured he was just turning off somewhere, and that would be the end of it. But then, a large school bus pulled in front of me, and I had to focus on the road. For a moment, I lost sight of the BMW. I kept going and got into the left turn lane near my school. While I waited behind the bus to make the turn, I suddenly heard beeping again. I looked to my right and saw the same tan BMW had pulled up beside me, not in a lane. He was sitting in the oncoming traffic lane, which was busy with cars. It didn't make sense for him to be there. He looked right at me and started pointing toward a nearby parking lot. Then, he made a sharp right turn into it. I stayed in my lane, confused and a little tense. He had no reason to act like that. I didn't follow him. I just raised my hand slightly, as if asking what he wanted. He stayed parked in the lot, facing toward me, watching. I turned my head away and kept my eyes on the bus ahead, trying to act like I wasn't bothered, but I was. It didn't feel right. There were cars lined up behind me, all waiting to turn into the school. I told myself he wouldn't do anything with that many people around. Still, I stayed alert. I watched the bus finally make the left turn, and then I followed it into the school. I didn't see the BMW behind me after that, but it would have been hard to tell with the line of cars behind me. The whole thing left me uneasy. I kept thinking maybe he was trying to accuse me of something or was just angry for no reason.